So next up, we have a presentation from Brennan, who's the Global Director of Innovation at MEDIACOM, talking along with Charlotte Diemer, who's the Global Head of Insights at Ogury. Not the same old, the real mobile opportunity. So I'm intrigued to hear what this presentation is about. So I'll hand over to Liam and Charlotte.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the session. I'm very excited about this. Liam and I had the pleasure of working together throughout the first lockdown on profiling user behavior and understanding what that means for clients. And I think it's really fascinating if we think about this, because throughout this pandemic, really, mobile has become kind of the screen of reference. We've been spending more time with media, but especially mobile has been benefiting from it. So while certain behaviors have not changed, right, I'm not going to use the sentence new normal. We all want to connect. We all want to have a job, have a shelter, eat, drink. There are certain needs to stay the same, but the priorities have shifted, right? So I'm really curious, Liam, actually from your perspective, what have you seen in terms of real mobile or behavior changes in general, and how have you helped your clients navigate these changes?
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Hope you're all doing well. Yeah, it's weird to be talking about this in lockdown again. I think it would be very not to have another lockdown chat about this. But, you know, a lot of the behaviors we saw, I think a lot of people have heard about in the press. We saw a lot of shift in the media consumption, of course, so people shifting to more digital video, you know, things like gaming, away from linear television, outdoor and cinema, obviously badly here, but importantly into mobile. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. I think the other interesting behavior that we saw really emerge, apart from obviously the trend of sort of buying online, was this sort of change in how people research and how people act. I think what's been important for us and how we navigated the pandemic was actually being abreast of actually what changes were happening in real time as the world was shifting. There was an immediate shift in the first week of lockdown in behavior, but as markets came out of lockdown and as markets had different levels of severity of lockdown, we saw some slight different changes in how people shopped, whether that be online or physical store, but also as content came and went, people would shift their behaviors back and forth to what channels they were watching. So you had almost like two tiers of behavioral sort of shifting clients we worked with. One was just merely shifting the eyeballs. So that was being abreast of what those changes were in terms of media consumption and moving the money around accordingly. The other more interesting one was trying to adapt to that human behavior where like people shopped. So for example, if people started shopping more in e-commerce environments versus physical environments, that not only affected your media selection to drive people sort of more directly into the store, it also affected your messaging. But also it was about when we were coming out of the lockdown, it was different. I know we'll talk a little bit today about mobile and that, but mobile became an incredibly useful behavior change monitor, for lack of a better term, because we could start to see things like shifting patterns in how people moved around cities and in terms of how people were using apps. So one of the interesting things that came out of our lockdown research, which we did with Ogury, was looking at supermarket apps. In France, for example, one of the more severe lockdowns to start with, and one of the ones that sort of got loosened quickly, we saw a massive lift in all the supermarket apps the first couple of weeks of the lockdown, when people just started buying whatever they could buy in the supermarket app. Then the month afterwards, they all went back to normal with the exception of Carrefour. And it was interesting because people wanted to shift back to behaviors they were doing before. It's much easier to buy things in a physical store. Online commerce is a terrible experience if you're trying to buy 10 different items at once. But Carrefour as a brand grew because they were the market leader in that market. And so they became the default supermarket app of choice if you did want to stay with them. Otherwise, everyone else went back to normal. So really interesting trying to navigate changes beyond what you saw in the press around media shift, but actually really understand the nitty-gritty of how people acted and how people changed their behavior depending on the brands that we were working for.
It's really, really interesting that you mentioned retail. I also find it fascinating if you think about how people pay, in fact, because we have seen a shift on that as well. Here, what we can see is, for example, market shares of delayed payment apps. It's like buy now, but pay later. And we've seen a dramatic increase in H1, but that has continued growing in H2 as well. And what this tells me is that actually, no matter our financial situation, but we still want to take part in that experience, which is shopping. And shopping is one of the defining experiences of our era, if we like it or not. So it's still about, what strikes me, what I find fascinating is about how brands can leverage this empathy almost that they should bring to the day when it comes to communicating with consumers. So I think this is interesting. And if we think about it in terms of usage as well, what we see here, for example, is the context of usage for ClearPay, which is a delayed payment apps again. So we see a lot of mobile commerce, we see a lot of e-commerce, we see a lot of general retail, but also, there's savings, there's credit apps. So what this tells me is the common trend, if we look at delivery, everything, what the common trend is about, okay, I want to buy now, I will pay later, but actually please deliver immediately. So it's almost like a sense of immediacy and of smooth user experience that we want to have, and which is something that I find interesting for brands, because probably they need to take that into account communicating in this space. So how do you see it, Liam? Do you think that, for example, the role of mobile is evolving, and how does that affect brands?
I think from that research, what we saw, definitely for brands we work with, is that when that shift to sort of more e-commerce and mobile commerce happened, it required brands to think more about connecting brand and commerce together where they hadn't before. Normally it's about creating, brand awareness or kind of jumping on people in consideration mindsets. But now it's more like, how can we connect that impression towards the buy? I think the previous presentation had a very positive outlook on travel for next year, but I think what frightens me is that the growth of those sort of apps, the buy now, pay later, is a sort of leading indicator of a recession mindset coming into play next year. And seeing like Afterpay in Australia, for example, doubling usage in the first month of lockdown is quite frightening of the economic repercussions we might be having next year. And I think brands need to be aware of that shift in behavior next year to a recession mindset and how we plan for that. I think when it comes to mobile and how that's evolving in that space, obviously you've got the screen that's on you at all times. So it's becoming the primary screen. It wasn't the primary screen before. So people watching video on mobile, people using it as a potential way of purchasing as well, because you can buy through the apps. But lastly, I think it's that mobile signal piece I mentioned before. We're going into next year with research that might be slightly redundant. Panel-based research at 6 months old will probably be incorrect in some ways, and we need to start looking at new sources of data, new sources of signals. So to have a device on a person 24/7 is also their primary media channel. The data you get from apps, the data you get from geolocation, from search data is incredibly useful for brands to help predict what will happen next year and help navigate changes, assuming we hopefully don't have a third lockdown, and maybe we can all have a nice little vaccination at some point next year and everything goes back to normal.
And it's about leveraging that mobile element for branding, isn't it?
Exactly. So it's not just a DR channel, it's becoming the primary screen, and these things are big screens now, people watch video on them. It's a great channel for branding as well as DR.
So last, when we have time for, what are 3 things that brands should not do in 2021?
So I'll be very quick because we're wrapping up. Number 1 is don't stop spending. In a recession, brands that grow coming out of a recession are the ones that spend their way through it. And the biggest brands grow, as I mentioned with the car, for example, just before. So it's an important time for you not to cut your budgets, continue to invest and grow, be considered to be the number 1 brand. The second thing is to be aware of those new data signals that I mentioned before. Keep track of how consumers' behavior is changing. It's not changing on a 6-monthly panel basis, it's often changing on a daily basis. And things like mobile and digital data becomes very, very important. And the last thing is, and I would say this is an innovation guy, is don't give up on your experimental mindset. Budgets are obviously going to be tight next year, and people will be looking to move money away from things that might not be proven to work. As we've seen in previous recessions in 2008, it's the brands that are the most innovative grow during this time. All the big brands that we know and love today, like Google and Amazon, Facebook, Airbnb, were all sort of born out of that last recession. And if you're a big brand and you're not looking at the new and you're not trying to find new ways to reach your consumers, you're going to be on the back foot against those brands that do invest in that space and have been playing around there for 2 or 3 years before you jump in. So don't think it's going to be a way to cut budgets and step back, step forward and lean in.